Despite growing recognition of the potential of climate to amplify existing conflict dynamics or even create new ones, the climate insecurity communities have thus far worked in isolation, ignoring the complex, multidimensional, and dynamic linkages between these two phenomena. To overcome these sectoral silos, it is essential to develop analytical tools that look at climate and conflict risks and how they interact in a systematic, integrated manner.
To dampen the impact of future ecological shocks, it is imperative to today increase the levels of resilience in the most vulnerable countries. So I think we need to understand that when it comes to resources, accessibility to resources, or to the devastating impact of natural disasters, this is not something that you can easily have, I would say, direct impact on. So let's also turn to the resilience of countries, because this is about decision made, development of different policies, development of good decisions, development of good governance, making sure that countries can develop levels of resilience.
A really important time to begin comparing local level information and information that is coming from headquarters, creating common maps and common understandings of what the issues are. I would say the notion of risk, the notion of drivers, identifying the drivers jointly, and then leading from there to different action paths, but taking into account the same evidence.
We need to get much better at seeing where these perfect storms are, where these hotspots will arise. We're often working in imperfect data universes when we have conflict situations. So there's a real ask for us there to think about how we can use real-time data better around assuring food security, looking for the places and the people where attention is most needed.
Hello, everyone. My name is Leni Wallenberg, and I am from CCAFS and the CGIAR, where I lead the Low Emissions Development Program. Our topic today is climate change mitigation and climate security, and we're interested specifically in how to meet both of these goals, two topics that are rarely discussed at the same table, let alone pursued jointly. I'd like to focus today on the case of natural resources and energy, and I'm going to talk a bit about forests as a specific example. So in the case of forests, they matter for both climate and for security. In the case of climate, forests are the largest terrestrial sink of carbon. They store about 15 times our global emissions, and they sequester every year about 2 billion tons of CO2. They also are places that are extremely vulnerable to losing that CO2. To losing that carbon. In addition to being extremely important for climate, they also matter for conflict. They're places of many illicit operations, whether production of drugs, illegal logging, illegal mining, human trafficking, poaching, and so on, as well as places where disputes about land claims and claims to resources, whether forests or whether trees, timber, mineral resources, are very common and often lead to this destruction of property. There are also places where armed conflict is not unusual. 80% of the armed conflict in the last several decades has taken place in biodiversity hotspots, many of which are forest areas. And we know that forests are often in places of international borders. They're places where insurrections are often hatched and that serve as refuges for insurrectionists or armed forces. And they're places where people can hide. So fundamentally, what all of this means is that forests matter. They matter for both security and for climate change. And we want to better understand, and this is what we will do in this seminar, we want to be able to better understand how these two forces influence each other. So we know that conflict and post-conflict conditions generally lead to a loss of forest, but not necessarily. There are at least three dynamics that matter. First, we have a vicious cycle of forest loss, degradation, that leads to more conflict, that leads to more forest degradation. Second, we have post-conflict and peace-building processes that can lead to increased deforestation if they open up previously militarized or otherwise protected forests, as in the case of Colombia, where road building led to more deforestation in the peace-building process. And both of these suggest a third dynamic, which is that during periods of transition or uncertainty, we tend to see land grabbing and people basically taking advantage of the resources, as has happened in Myanmar in the last year with the coup, where we see increased deforestation and illegal logging. And in the case of Indonesia, where I lived during the transition to decentralization, and we saw also extraordinary loss of forest. One thing all of these dynamics have in common is that they leave the forest vulnerable. The forest is vulnerable to insecurity, especially in the forests that we care about most for climate change mitigation, which are the tropical forests. Forests are far from centers of power. They generally lack legal enforcement. They're subject to weak state institutions, but often strong local informal institutions. In China, there's a saying that the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. Add to this mix vulnerable populations, valuable resources, illicit actors, and you have a potent recipe for insecurity. What does this mean then for climate change mitigation, where we need to protect forests over decades? And we also need strong institutions for monitoring and distributing finance. So turning to the climate change mitigation institutions themselves in forest areas, we have REDD+, which is reducing emissions due to deforestation and forest degradation. And we also have net zero company commitments to try to reduce their own deforestation. We have more than $5 billion in pledges of public funds, and we have more than 400 million in corporate and voluntary market funds for avoided deforestation. And as of January 2020, we have 50 low and middle income countries who've submitted information to the UNFCCC indicating their intention to implement REDD in about 70% of their forest areas, representing 63 billion tons of carbon. And so what does this mean in terms of impacts on security of these initiatives? We think from our initial review of the evidence that they have the potential to at least initially contribute to conflict. The promise of finance is leading to speculation and green grabbing. New actors are making claims to forest. It's encouraging corruption, displacement, inequity, and we have that transition instability that I mentioned earlier. We also have the potential for new economic winners and losers, people who are losing their access to forests, and some countries will just not be eligible for these funds because they have high levels of insecurity and they're not REDD ready, for example. And finally, we have centrally imposed processes that don't necessarily link to these local conditions, and so we have conflict. At the same time, we can imagine that some of these initiatives are also going to be increasing transparency and accountability, and enforcement should address some of the illicit activities. So we have a mix, and we're still trying to figure out what will actually happen. And to that end, we have commissioned together with the Dala Institute a report to better understand the dynamics of climate change mitigation and security in forest areas. So some of the initial conclusions of this work are around the institutions that we need. As I mentioned, forests are hotspots for both climate change mitigation and conflict. They're vulnerable to this mitigation and to the loss of carbon and to increased conflict. And then finally, how can we address this? We need stronger institutions. So first, how can we continue to support the rule of law, both for climate change mitigation, integrating climate change mitigation and peace and security, taking advantage of new tools that make it less expensive to monitor real time using big data, using drones and cameras. Second, then, is to also manage the tenure and access to forest resources, especially where there's carbon trading or any kind of commodification of carbon, to prevent the green grabbing, to recognize prior and overlapping claims, and to ensure socially just outcomes. Third, We want to better integrate forest conservation and climate change goals into peace processes to monitor performance and ensure that institutions are invested in for the enforcement and the finance delivery that goes along with programs like REDD. And finally, we want to enable localizing programs, creating stakeholder processes and better conflict resolution mechanisms. So those are my key messages. Forests are hotspots. They're vulnerable. We need better institutions. Thank you very much. Let's turn over now to Mark Goldberg and our 4 excellent panelists.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the host of the Global Dispatches podcast, and today's episode is being recorded as a live taping of the podcast. In today's conversation, we are going to examine how climate change mitigation efforts in land use and forestry can be both drivers of security and insecurity. Now, Linny Wallenberg just offered a very comprehensive background and overview of the issues and topics under discussion today, so I would like to dive right in and introduce our excellent panelists that we have assembled for you today. Sharon Burke is the president of Ecospherics. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Davith Stewart is an environmental crime and law enforcement expert. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
Jan Petter Schilling is Scientific Director of Peace Academy Rhineland-Palatinate, University of Koblenz-Landau. Welcome.
Hi, everyone.
And Augusto Castro Nunez is the Theme Leader for Low Emission Food Systems and Peace Building, the Alliance of Bioversity International, and CIAT. Welcome all. So I am going to kick off with some questions, but leave plenty of time for audience participation. To ask a question of the panelists, please simply leave your question in the comment field wherever you are watching it. We'll see those comments as they come in. So to kick off to our panelists, I am going to ask you all to briefly respond to Linny Wallenberg's opening remarks. Listening to her introduction and framing, what are examples you have seen in your work about how we can achieve climate change mitigation and improve security in the land sector? And Sharon, I will start with you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. So I'm going to zoom up to the 30,000 foot level and start there. I think, first we have to consider that the modern global economy has brought us to this point of environmental crisis. And that's a conundrum because everyone deserves to live with the benefits of the industrial age, whether that's COVID vaccines or access to electricity. But that industrial past is killing the future. It's destroying resources, as Linny laid out so well, such as forests. So we have to harness the innovation of the digital era to this challenge of changing the way we all live and the way we want to live, more to the point. That's going to require a huge amount of science and technology innovation, but also institutional and societal innovation. And it's not just about making better things or even better energy. I think Linny talked about information technology, for example. So big data, remote sensing, machine learning, these things can also be a big help because that technology can not just help with monitoring, but also with early warning for conflict and early action. And it can enable early action. So for example, by better forecasting for conditions such as drought that can lead to instability and unrest. And those are the kinds of innovations that can help us shift the way we govern around environmental conflict from largely reactive and waiting for problems to emerge to become crises to preventive and anticipatory, allowing us to do a better job of building resilience to the changes that we're going to see and towards prioritizing our actions and our investments in mitigation in a way that'll prevent crises. To me, that's inherently about conflict prevention and about building peace rather than fighting wars, which I think in my country is where a lot of the investment has been focused on. It's on being ready to fight wars rather than building peace. And this is also a virtual cycle because you can only get to change on this scale through collective means. It's the only way. And that certainly includes the United States and China. So this kind of investment in mitigation can be a confidence building measure more broadly for peace and security. And I think, if I were going to sum that all up, I'd say we can either suffer alone or adapt and mitigate together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. David, same question to you. What are examples you have seen in your work about how we can achieve climate change mitigation and improve security in the land sector?
Thank you, Mark. And I particularly liked the introduction from Lini, and I endorse a lot of her feedback and her comments. I'm going to come at it particularly from the perspective of my work experience, which has largely been focused on supporting law enforcement agencies that are looking at illegal logging and criminality within the timber industry. So I'd start just by bringing up the fact that illegal logging and forestry crime is estimated to be worth as much as $150 billion per year, according to estimates by the United Nations and Interpol. So with that sort of money at stake, the illegal timber industry is attracting many of the world's largest organized crime groups. And apart from the serious environmental damage that illegal logging and agricultural expansion is causing, it also has particularly deadly, unfortunately that's the right word, deadly consequences for lots of local communities and indigenous people that live in and around forests. A recent report that was released by the environmental non-governmental organisation Global Witness found that there's over 200 environmental activists who are killed every year. That's an average of more than 4 a week. I think the primary issue here is unclear land ownership, which often causes conflict over who should have access to forest areas. And this is a particular problem in many developing countries that don't have that have poorly maintained land title registries, and the registers are often not kept correctly, which of course creates opportunities for fraudulent documents and for bribery of government officials. The activists that are most at risk from being killed for their activism are those who are working against the mining sector, agribusiness, or the logging industry. And Latin America, unfortunately, has consistently been the most dangerous continent for environmental activists. So these disputes are usually stemming over conflict over the forest land as mining, agriculture and logging operations move in and encroach on forest areas that are relied upon by many local communities and indigenous people who are using the resources of the forest for their own survival. In fact, 40% of those who are killed for environmental activism are indigenous peoples. And on top of that, approximately 150 rangers and law enforcement officers are killed every year in the line of duty for protecting parks and wildlife. So while it's absolutely correct that climate mitigation efforts should be including strategies to protect forest areas, the forest areas are not without risk for conflict and security, and I'd like to see more efforts in strengthening law enforcement and particularly securing the rights and the protections of the people that live in and near forests.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Jan, Petter, over to you for your response to Lini Wallenberg's opening remarks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark, for that question. I mean, I can tell you what doesn't work. If we stretch out, implement REDD+, and local communities lose access to forests, and that was mentioned in Lini's and also in Darwin's contribution, then something goes wrong. Because if we try to mitigate climate change, what we need to do, we all agree on that, but the local effects are negative, then something goes wrong. The same with wind power. If we install renewable energy and that's so green and that's great, but if that means that the communities right next to the wind park, once it's done, are still sitting in the dark, then we know something went wrong. And the question is, and that's a tricky one, how do we avoid that? How can we make climate mitigation efforts peace positive, or at least have more than local benefits for the communities? And what we need to do, and we need to be quick with that, is to get away from the center of putting the project at the center, but putting the local communities at the center. What does that mean? That means we're not trying to only build the wind park, but we are first looking at the local communities where we want to build the wind park and see what needs do they have, what values do they have, what potential conflicts they have. And we first need to understand that before we can even erect the first wind turbine or think about any carbon project in terms of REDD+ or any forest conservation. So we need to move away from the project orientation to the local communities. They need to be the ones strongly benefiting in terms of resources, infrastructure, money, before we can think of climate mitigation.
Thank you. And Augusto, over to you. Augusto, you are going to need to unmute your microphone.
Okay, thanks, Mark. As the previous panelists have mentioned, conflict and climate change mitigation in the land sector are connected, not only in their drivers, but they are also connected in their solutions. So I will cite, and I want to cite two examples of current efforts towards climate security and peace building in the agriculture, forestry, and land sector. The first example is the Biocarbon Fund Initiative for Sustainable Forest Landscapes. This is a multilateral facility that the World Bank manages. The Biocarbon Fund integrates the issue of climate change mitigation and peace building by, for instance, promoting and rewarding reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in regions affected by conflict in the Orinoquia region in Colombia. The second example is the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. The goal of this multi-stakeholder dialogue platform, which the World Cocoa Foundation promotes, is that the global cocoa value chain achieves zero deforestation production. In Colombia, this initiative is called Cocoa Forest and Peace Initiative and targets areas affected by conflict. And the third example is the Sustainable Land Use System project. The International Climate Initiative of Germany funds this project, and we at the Alliance of Biodiversity and SEAT are the lead implementers. One of our main goals is to integrate into policies and programs in Colombia the issues of climate change mitigation, land restoration, along with peace building. This supports the effort of Colombia to meet its commitments to the Paris Agreement, to the peace agreement that it signed with the FARC in 2016, but also to the Paris Agreement. Those three examples illustrate the efforts that integrate climate change mitigation and peace building, but much more needs to happen to achieve both objectives. This includes scaling up and out sustainable land uses, but also developing frameworks on how to integrate and measure contributions to our climate change security and peace building.
Thank you. Thank you all for your opening remarks. We're going to now dive a little deeper into your own individual areas of expertise. And Sharon Burke, I will start with you. You have held several positions at the intersection of natural resources and security, and now have your own consultancy, which works in this area. What are some of the big ideas that you're seeing to leverage mitigation for peace building to both work towards the Paris Agreement targets and also increase security?
Well, I think specifically I want to address energy and just to say that I think that energy poverty is still a major global problem. About a billion people lack access to electricity, and far more than that lack reliable access. Even in my own country, where we've had nearly universal electricity access for decades, we've had a wake-up call with storms this winter and wildfires this summer that are still going on in my native California, about the way that climate change is impacting the reliability of our energy access. So I think in the bigger picture, corruption and instability historically come with fossil fuel production. It's just part and parcel of the ownership of land and mineral rights and how profits are distributed or not distributed, as the case may be. So I think I think we'll probably return to this later and talk more about energy and how energy is a concern, unless you want me to keep talking about energy right now.
We can get back to that. We'll keep this conversation going and flowing. Thank you. And David, I'm going to turn to you now. You worked for several years at Interpol. Can you briefly draw on your previous experience at Interpol? How does Interpol, through its environmental program and partnerships with intergovernmental organizations, contribute to mitigating climate change in forested areas?
Thank you, Mark. It's probably good that I give a little overview of Interpol, because I'm not sure a lot of people are aware that it even has an environmental crime program. But That's okay because our target audience is mostly the world's law enforcement community. But when Interpol first established its environmental crime unit, the first step it took really was to raise awareness and provide training about what is forest crime and what is the scale of the problem. So, to start with the scale, globally, illegal logging makes up 15 to 30% of the timber supply. And in some key tropical rainforest countries, illegal logging is actually 50 to 90% of all forest activities. So it's a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise that's clearing a football field of forest every 2 seconds. The issue with forestry crime is that it's a truly international crime. So a company from one country cuts timber in another. The logs are shipped to the sawmills in a third country, where the timber is often then mixed with other logs and false paperwork is prepared to hide the original source of the timber. And meanwhile, of course, the profits are siphoned off to bank accounts in tax havens. So the illegal activity in the industry is a combination of fraud, bribery, false documents, and of course there are lawyers and accountants who are helping hide the illicit profits. So organizations, international organizations like Interpol and also the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime work together to bring law enforcement agencies together from different countries to target the forest crime across multiple jurisdictions. So the work is largely focused on providing support through capacity building and training, efforts to help the world's police community recognize how forest crime works and give the officers the skills and the knowledge they need. And I just, to conclude, say that, one of the successes we've seen is that a lot of police forces now are establishing dedicated forestry crime units in their countries and conducting cross-border operations and investigations.
Thank you. And now, Augusto, to you, your work in Colombia aims to align climate change mitigation, adaptation, and peace-building efforts. Can you explain how this is done on the ground in Colombia and what signs of improved security and climate change mitigation impacts that you're seeing?
Wow, thanks. Good question, Mark. We work in mainstream CER research on climate change and peace building into the work of various programs as well, including the Orinoquia Biocarbon Fund Initiative and the Cacao Forest and Peace Initiative that I mentioned before. Through the SLUS project, the Sustainable Land Use System project, we work with the cacao and livestock value chains to develop practices and business models that contribute to both climate change mitigation and peace building. We are not interested only in climate change, neither in only peace building. We are integrated in those outcomes together. As to the impacts, we see improved livelihoods among livestock producers. We also see cacao farmers having better access to markets. In farms, we see improved water and land management and richer biodiversity, also low emissions. Those impacts, however, are only at farm level. That is because most of the initiatives are at that level. And that's an issue. The massive adoption of practices that integrate climate mitigation and peace building is not yet happening. We expect, however, good results when it happens. We are aware also that the massive adoption of such practices may have unintended consequences. I think that David has already mentioned some of them. However, we are aware that the massive adoption of such practices may have unintended consequences, for instance, in the form of deforestation leakage. That is why it is important to develop not only safeguards, but also frameworks for integrating and measuring the contributions of all these initiatives to climate security and peace building. And that is where research for development comes in. Thanks.
Thank you. So Jan, Peter, one of the things I love about moderating this climate security series is that we always make room and are sure to include perspectives from academia, researchers, and scientists. So from the academic world, what research is needed to make sure mitigation projects don't harm climate security and instead contribute towards peace and security? And how do we make sure peace and security initiatives are climate sensitive?
Yeah, again, excellent question. Thanks, Mark. So what we need is an understanding of the local dynamics, as I tried to mention in my previous statement. And what that implies is that we need to dedicate money and time to field research, geographic, ethnographic, research that is really understanding the local context before we can come in and mingle and change anything. So really the focus should be on understanding the local governance of resources, the local power dynamics, the local conflict potential, and also how any project might impact these. That's what you usually summarize under conflict sensitivity. And what we also need, and that's, I'm looking at myself there, is not only on how these lead to conflict, but also positive examples. And here we are in the region of environmental peace building, where we actually try to identify environmental challenges and risks as common obstacles, common problems that we can overcome together. So in a nutshell, what we need to understand the local context, but the academia or academic world needs to focus also more on what works and not only on what doesn't work and what leads to conflicts. Because we know what leads to conflicts. These are basically two headlines. One, either we introduce resources that are scarce on the ground, and that can cause competition, and my fellow speakers have mentioned some of the dynamics, or you take away resources from the people. For instance, if you lock them out of forests, that is also likely to contribute to conflicts. And in terms of research, we need to understand both if you have abundance resources, if you introduce resources, if you have scarcity of resources, but also how a project as a wind farm can contribute to peace and to positive example. And there the literature is much less developed.
Thank you. Now, Sharon, let us have that conversation about energy now. What positive impacts could the energy transition, that is away from centralized fossil fuel production, bring for peace and achieving emissions targets?
Thanks, Mark. You know I was in a hurry to get to this point, so I'm glad to get here. And I already said a few things about energy poverty. Before I talk about energy, I just wanted to comment on something Jan Petter said about needing to shift the focus to what works and not just what doesn't work. I think that's brilliant. I completely agree with that. And also would say part of that focus needs to be on sort of what in my community we'd call actionable research, in that, I think remains a big gap between what we know in the research field and what we need to know in order to implement. So just wanted to add that in. As for energy, I think it's inherent in your question, Mark, that the democratizing effect of decentralized renewable energy has a potential to change the way that energy politics have functioned. But one of the things that concerns me about that is that we do have to be careful we're not trading one resource trap for a different one, because renewable energy depends on natural resources too, and specifically critical minerals, such as the lithium and the cobalt in the batteries of electric vehicles, or the tellurium and indium and cadmium in solar cells. The production of those minerals refracts through national governments and land rights and mineral ownership too, and it's a dirty business. And I don't just mean that in terms of the corruption of human systems, but the land use implications in mining and the pollution of processing. So there are many things we can do right now to help make sure that this transition to renewables is positive. First, we need to invest in radical energy efficiency, especially in countries such as mine, where the per capita energy consumption is very high. We just have to make this problem smaller if we're going to be able to solve it. And that's a win-win when it comes to the mitigation challenge and the Paris goals. We need to find better ways to recycle and recover minerals and materials, lower impact ways of mining and processing, minimizing how much you need for any given technology. And we have to do a better job of strengthening the rule of law around resources. And that just benefits peace and security more generally. We need to plan in a bigger sense about how to help the losing parties in this transition. Lini talked about this too with forests. You cannot let success in mitigation become itself a threat to peace and stability. And I think Jan Petter called this a peace positive mitigation. We need to make sure these things are moving in the same direction and are not pitted against each other.
And for those listening, not watching, Jan Petter just gave you a big thumbs up for that last remark. And Sharon, I'm glad that you referenced corruption, because it's not, that's often not part of our conversations on climate change, frankly. But David, over to you. We might expect, during the UN Food Systems Summit, which is going to happen during the UN General Assembly, and then COP26 in November, increased commitments in climate finance. And with this in mind, it obviously raises questions about the impact of corruption, fraud, and other kinds of criminal activities, what impact that has on climate finance, and how does this impact how we approach climate change mitigation efforts?
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, foreign investment and corruption seem to go pretty much hand in hand. And unfortunately, the forest sector itself is particularly vulnerable to corruption, largely because many of the forests, particularly the tropical forests, are located in countries that have weak governance, have poor regulatory regimes, and low law enforcement capacity. And there's been repeated studies that have confirmed there's a direct relationship between the rate of illegal logging and the level of corruption in a country. So if you plot on a graph the level of corruption in a country, and you can use Transparency International's Consumer Corruption Perception Index, and you map that against the percentage of the illegal timber that is produced in that country, you see a direct relationship. They're directly proportional to one another, which means, in other words, that countries with higher levels of corruption tend to have higher rates of illegal logging and deforestation. Interpol, in fact, has estimated that the global cost of corruption in the forestry sector is worth almost $30 billion a year. But even more important than the economic cost is that corruption and bribery of the public officials seriously undermines governance in the world's forests and seriously questions the effectiveness of any international strategy that might be implemented to protect forests, particularly the corruption at high level amongst government influences government policy. It pushes forest crime to a low priority on the legislative agenda. It reduces the resources that are available to law enforcement. And it also undermines the attitudes of the timber industry itself. They're affected by their perception of corruption amongst regulators and government officials. And that lack of trust itself of the government agencies reduces their level of compliance with regulation. So I would just say that clearly corruption itself must be addressed in any climate finance program before we're going to have any really effective efforts at reducing deforestation.
Thank you. And to you, Augusto, from your experience, what are the key lessons you've learned to help manage long-term conflict in ways that support both peace and efforts to mitigate climate change?
We are talking about fragile states. We are talking about fragile states, and we want to reduce emissions in fragile states. So that's something complicated. So there are three lessons that I could draw from my experience.
It appears we are having some challenge with your line, Augusto. We will come back to you, though. Please, we'll see if we can improve your line. Let me just briefly turn to Jan Petter, and then we'll come back to you to see if your connection has improved, Augusto. Jan Petter, can you just briefly draw on your experiences in Africa? How can climate change mitigation help strengthen peace and security in Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, any mitigation project, and they're usually large scale, otherwise they are harder to finance. So if we're talking about large wind farms, or if we're talking about a larger REDD+ project, means resources. That means access roads to the resource. If you want to build a wind park, you need roads for that. If you need to access a forest, also roads are usually helpful. So it does mean some sort of infrastructure, and it does mean attention to that region where the project is supposed to be implemented. And of course, that's a chance. That's a chance to for the local communities to get access to resources that otherwise they might not have access to. So in theory, that can be a good thing, and that can be a win-win situation. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that usually those local actors benefit who are already in a better off position, and those who have less power significantly benefit less from the project, or are even more marginalized. And here we're coming back to the issue of land tenure, for instance, in forest projects. So for those who are like illegally using the forests, for instance, for charcoal production or to get firewood or other activities, and then a project comes in, formalizes these land tenure issues and the land rights, and then even forcefully, then the local communities are excluded from the resources. And that is something that cannot happen because otherwise we might be winning on the climate mitigation side, but really detrimentally losing on the local end.
Thank you. And let's see if we can get Augusto back. Augusto.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Great, fantastic. Okay, there are three lessons that I can draw from my experience. The first lesson is that climate action and peace building can create virtuous cycles that generate co-benefits. For instance, the success of climate action hinges on stability. In places where armed conflict is present, peacemaking and humanitarian efforts can help create the environment that will pave the way for those places to be ready for climate action. In the long term, climate action can bring long-lasting peace. Understanding the connection between the drivers of land-based emissions and the drivers of conflict will facilitate this process and will maximize the co-benefits and prevent undesired consequences. My second lesson is that efforts to achieve peace can deliver undesired outcomes. These outcomes include deforestation and carbon emissions. The same thing can be said about efforts for forest conservation. They can exacerbate the drivers of conflict, as has been mentioned before. Why this has happened lies in the lack of a unified framework for designing climate security and peace-building interventions. Take the case of the cocoa production in African countries that emerged from conflict. What was meant to promote peace building turned into a major driver of deforestation and carbon emissions. Likewise, in Colombia, there is a risk of unified deforestation from efforts to escape sustainable livestock systems. The third lesson is that efforts to conserve forests and reduce land-based emissions can unintentionally exacerbate land-related conflicts, particularly those that restrict land access. We have this is well documented, as has been previously mentioned by David. In Colombia, for instance, efforts to escape sustainable livestock can fuel conflict, particularly if the connection between livestock, land grabbing, deforestation, and conflict is not well understood. But this can be the opposite, and we need to work on that.
Thank you all. And I have one more question for each of you. Before I ask that question, I do want to remind viewers that you can ask a question of the panelists simply by leaving a comment field a comment in the stream, wherever you're watching this. So final question to the panelists, if you have 1 minute each to answer. Recently, the IPCC once again released a report stressing the urgency of the climate crisis. So I wanted to ask each of you what you or your organization will do in the next 10 years in the field of mitigation and security to help promote mitigation and increase security at the same time. Sharon, I will turn to you.
Thanks, Mark. Well, my organization is brand new, and what we plan to do, what I hope we do over the next 10 years is help my country shift its definition of security. For most of our history, the United States has defined security as being all about warfighting, and we've disproportionately focused on that. In the current circumstances with global environmental change and all the things we've been talking about today, we really need to shift our definition to be about security building and peace building. And I hope that I can help my country achieve that over the next 10 years. Well, much sooner than the next 10 years, within the next year.
Well, thank you. And as a fellow countryman, it's heartening to hear a former senior official at the Department of Defense say such a thing. David, to you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, in principle, I would hope to see organizations like Interpol and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime continue to do more of what they have been doing in terms of providing training and expert advice to law enforcement agencies and helping coordinate cross-border operations and investigations. But I have to also say, the blunt answer to your question is that unfortunately none of that work will happen in the decade ahead unless there is sufficient financial support. So Interpol's environmental crime program, for example, is not a core function of Interpol. It relies 100% on external funding sources, and it's the same for other international organizations within the UN, the World Customs Organization, Europol, etc., that all rely on additional funding to support their environmental crime programs. So really, we need to see in these international negotiations more emphasis and more investment in law enforcement to ensure that any policy strategies you have for forest protection are going to include proper funding for law enforcement. As I said earlier, forestry crime may be worth up to $150 billion a year, but World Bank estimates of how much money is available for law enforcement is less than 0.1% of that. law enforcement are dealing with just a pittance to tackle the amount of money that the criminals hold. And international organisations like Interpol get only 1% of that, again, in terms of their efforts to deal with the international aspects of forestry crime.
Thank you. And Augusto, to you.
Yeah, at Alliance Biodiversity and CEAT, we have a community of researchers working to address climate crisis by developing and testing three things. That is being done as part of our work on climate security and peace building. First, we are developing and testing frameworks that integrate and improve the coordination of activities on climate action and peace building. That's key. Second, we are generating indicators that can measure, monitor, and report contributions to the two objectives, climate action and peace building. And the third, we are developing and testing sustainable land use systems, value chain strategies, and business models that contribute toward climate action and peace building. We have been doing all this in Colombia, and our hope is to scale our efforts to other countries where these issues also intersect. Thanks.
Okay, and Jan Petter, to you.
Well, what we can do is to write research on exactly the question that we've been discussing now for the past 45 minutes or so, is how can climate mitigation and adaptation as well, we haven't talked so much about that, but climate mitigation strengthen local resilience, be conflict sensitive, and ideally be peace positive? That is certainly not an easy question, but we at the Peace Academy at the University of Koblenz-Landau are on it.
All right, thank you all. We are now going to turn to the audience, and I'm going to bring in Reese Bucknall-Williams to facilitate this part of the conversation. Welcome, Reese, and I take it we've had a number of questions come in from the audience, so over to you. You might need to unmute.
Apologies there. Okay. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. Yes, we've had a lot of questions coming in on LinkedIn and YouTube, so it's great to see that this really great discussion is driving those questions. And my first question maybe is to David, and this is one that's been the question has been asked a few times actually in the chat, and it's more about, I mean, you've kind of talked about the kind of crime elements and the financial institutions or the kind of financial system that perhaps supports these crimes. Perhaps what changes would you perhaps like to see in maybe consumer behavior or financial institutions or financial protocols that could perhaps help mitigate against, you know, forestry crime or crimes in other natural resource sectors?
Thank you. Yes, I think focusing on financial institutions, as you mentioned there, I think is an important point. There is a lot of investment made in the timber industry, and I think unfortunately a lot of the, whether it's banks or financial investors or simply other companies that are doing business with members of the timber industry, I don't think they fully appreciate the risks that they themselves are at if they are investing in and supporting a company that is breaching forestry laws, committing illegal logging, perhaps involved in some conflicts at the local level. So I think there really needs to be a little bit more understanding that there is a compliance risk to those to financial institutions and those that are working with and propping up a lot of these logging companies, sawmills, companies involved in transport, and all of those companies along the timber supply chain. Behind all of them are financial backers, lawyers, other companies doing business. There is a significant need to understand that they play a role, and perhaps in the future, particularly as we're seeing legal liability laws changing and the courts starting to be a little bit more willing to recognize that perhaps there's liability on behalf of these companies and these financial institutions for their role in propping up and supporting these illegal activities.
Okay, great, thank you. So my next question perhaps is for Augusto. So we've seen in the media recently lots of stories about countries like Brazil or Myanmar or the DRC or Colombia, with well sort of publicized issues around the management of maybe some natural resources. Of course, in countries like Afghanistan, for example, the situation we're seeing there, actually it's a country very rich in minerals. So there's some questions about the kind of systems and management that can go going forward for the extraction of those and the management of those and the sale of those. So through your analysis, I was wondering if you have sort of examples of maybe countries that have maybe a positive story to say about this, and maybe who've been able to build up systems, and perhaps what innovations or knowledge kind of tools or ecosystems have helped them do that.
Well, positive example, there for sure exists, not necessarily at the country level, but probably at the subnational scale. We've seen many local contexts where, for instance, promoting sustainable land use systems well connected to markets have reduced huge amounts of illegal cross production. That can be seen in Peru, for instance, in Colombia as well. However, these are context-specific cases that we need to understand better in order to scale up them to other places and scale out them to other places. And unfortunately, most of these issues and these interconnected problems between land-based emissions and conflict are context-specific. So we cannot generalize. And what is happening is that we tend to generalize based on 2-3 examples. Mostly Brazil, Indonesia, DRC are cases that we've seen and we study a lot, and then we try to move those examples to other countries. And that's something that we can improve for sure.
We certainly have time for more questions. So Reese, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. So maybe my next question is perhaps maybe Jan-Peter. Might be best for you. So there's a growing sort of interest in climate security as a kind of broad topic in bodies like the UN Security Council and others. How can we sort of tap into that, and how can we perhaps extend this dynamism in this area to into broader peace building operations throughout sort of UN, the system, and beyond?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the climate security community has mostly focused on the impact of climate change on peace and security. So yeah, I mean, the typical less rainfall, more conflicts between farmers and herders as one of the typical examples. But the climate security community, both as researchers, but certainly at the UN level or at the international policy level, has much less focused on climate mitigation and adaptation measures and their conflict implications. And that's why I very much welcome this talk here, and I was happy to join it, because a lot more attention needs to be paid both by academics, but also on the international policy making level on the conflict implications of especially large-scale mitigation and adaptation projects, because that is now the big thing that will impact people on the ground on top of the climate impact. So yeah, thank you for the question, and I hope I could at least partly answer it.
Yeah, thank you. And my next question maybe is for Sharon, and you talked a lot about the kind of energy question. So given the huge interest internationally in sort of new sort of net zero technologies, electric vehicles, for example, which obviously drive up demand for resources, what's the best way for engaging with the private sectors, for big companies like Tesla, for example, what's the best way of engaging with them on the question of resources and how they can support this, the policy and action?
Well, I think there's a variety of ways. And one, it certainly starts with governments having good policies. And I think we still have a lot of work to do in that space to make sure that the regulatory frameworks and the incentive structures are lined up for the right things. And also, for a company such as Tesla, or better yet, even talking about the energy industry where the profit margins are very thin, governments also have a role to be investing in research and development, because that innovation, there's significant innovation that needs to happen, and we can't just rely on the companies to do that sort of transformational research. So, but I think at the same time, for a company such as Tesla, what their supply chain is and how they source it, and what their practices are all along the way are really important and can be destructive or constructive. And there has to be accountability for that, and also proactively. I think there's been a good record here of the non-governmental and the civil society sector setting up the mechanisms and the pressure to make sure that companies are being are conducting themselves well in this regard.
Great, thank you. And I guess there's a question for everyone. So if anybody has an answer, then they feel free to chip in. Obviously, this year is a very busy year for international diplomacy on policy. So you have the Food System Summit, you have COP26, you have the COP on biodiversity, which has been delayed into next year. But there's lots of opportunities for engaging with policy and for driving policy. And I just wanted to open the floor really to anybody who has a kind of wish list of things that they want to see. Like there was one thing they wanted to see delivered through these conferences that they think would help. What would that be?
If I could just comment really quickly on something Jan Petter said about climate security. I think that there's been a lot of interesting thought and interesting policy discussion, but not a lot of implementation. And I think that's often a problem when it comes to complex challenges like this, and particularly when you start adding in questions about land use and forestry and energy, that we just kind of lack the means to actually do something about it. So to me, what I would really like to see is in international organizations and in national governments, investing in the means to actually implement change here, not just to talk about it or study it.
And once again, Jan Petter vigorously nodded his head in reaction to your answer. So Jan Petter, maybe over to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I can just continue what Sharon was saying. I think it's important to understand the local context first, but then also to together with local actors. I think some of the comments were also, one was relating to that, of course, the more developed countries are the emitters and the most vulnerable or those facing the consequence of climate change. The Bangladesh example came up. And we have to make sure that now these climate mitigation adaptation strategies not become like another colonial endeavor where we extract the resources and mitigate and save our climate, but the local impacts are there and mostly detrimental. So, and to achieve that, we need to have social guardrails as some of the programs have, but we need to go beyond that and need to focus on the local communities. And that is definitely something I would recommend for any climate and whatever they are called this year, negotiations this year.
Thank you. And Augusto, over to you for a final remark.
Okay, thank you. I think that, yeah, it is clear that climate action can cause conflict, can be a driver of conflict, but climate action can also be a driver of peace. If you analyze what happens on the ground, what we promote for peace building and what we promote for reducing the emissions from deforestation or for forest conservation is mostly the same, but they are promoted from different perspectives. So what we need is to make them see the same, so that we can maximize the co-benefits of this. So that's the kind of research. Sometimes it's not about climate security or about climate peace building. It's about how we interconnect these two bodies of research to develop something that provides understanding of the local context, but at the same time provides solutions. So I would say that, yeah.
Thank you. And David, over to you for a final remark.
Yes, thank you. I think, I would sort of probably repeat a point that I've made before, which is that the problem with the overexploitation of natural resources is often not a problem of the lack of laws. The laws are on the books, but government regulators and law enforcement don't really have the capacity. So if they can't enforce the current laws now, then what is the point really of strengthening those laws, bringing in stricter, tighter regulations for logging companies, mining companies, agribusiness, etc., if the law enforcement doesn't have the capacity on the ground to implement it? So really, we need to ensure that when those policies are being negotiated at the international level, there is a thought given to how is this going to be implemented on the ground? Is the capacity there, whether it's government agencies or, and the same applies, are there local institutions, are there local communities with the capacity to implement it? And there needs to be an equal amount or perhaps a greater amount of investment and thought given into the practical implementation on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you all. I am going to bring Linny Wallenberg back in for some concluding remarks. Big thank you to the panelists. For those of you who are following the live stream, thank you for following. You can access other episodes that are part of this climate security series by subscribing to and following the Global Dispatches podcast. Thank you all, and over to you, Linny.
Thank you, Mark, and a huge thanks to our panelists and our audience and all of the facilitators. As you can see, this was a really lively discussion. and it is a dynamic field. I feel like the top has just been taken off on something that potentially could grow and have some serious implications for action. So the panelists have demonstrated really well the type and scale of vulnerabilities that we have in the forest and energy sectors in relation to mitigation and climate security, whether that's the level of violence, illegality, or corruption, the danger to lives, especially of environmental activists, to local communities and their rights to benefits in the forests around them. And that these are all profoundly interlinked across countries along the supply chain. And we can't just be blaming local forests and local communities, but rather also seeing the linkages all the way up to the consumers and the financiers. So what are some of the solutions that have been recommended? We've had I think a very strong vision put forth about what is possible and the need for resources. So finance for implementation. Some of the concrete suggestions made were to anticipate conflict and support early warning systems, for example, through digital technologies and institutions that support peace building, so that we're not always just putting out fires and wasting resources, but then create the conditions that are right for mitigation. That we need to be considering this capacity for law enforcement, providing training and capacity building. That we need better protection of the people living in the forest themselves, including the law enforcement professionals. That we need to be taking care not to simply recreate the problems that we've had, the problems that we have currently with existing resources by shifting that problem to other resources. That we need to integrate the goals of mitigation and peace building in our activities related to land use planning and business models. And that we especially need to be able to work with the local communities and strengthen resilience and support this implementation on the ground. So in response to the question from Reese about what would be the single message to give to the UN Food Systems Summit and the COP this year, I think it is really, I believe this was reinforced by both Sharon and Jan Peter, how can we have peace positive mitigation? How can we support climate change mitigation that reinforces this dynamic of peace building? So with that, I want to thank the organizers, all of the panelists in our audience, and wish everybody a good day.